So you think you can get married, have a husband, and just leave me single just like that? We are twins. We're supposed to do everything together as always. Stay in there for now. Let me go and get married to your husband-to-be. After all, he won't even know the difference because we've kissed a few times before.
You looking beautiful today, if I may ask. Where is your twin sister?
I don't know, too. Her number isn't reachable. Let's just get married first.
She thought she was marrying the love of her life. But the woman standing at that altar was not his bride. And the real bride, chained, blindfolded, and locked in darkness, while her own blood wore her wedding gown and said I do in her name. Stay with me, because what happened next will shatter everything you believe about love, loyalty, and the bond between twins. The miracle that came in pairs. In the ancient and noble town of Oguta, nestled in the heart of Imo State where the Great Lake shimmers like polished silver under the West African sun, there lived a man named Chukwuemeka Okafor and his beloved wife, Ngozi Chukwuka. The people of Oguta called Chukwuemeka Emeka for short, and he was known throughout the surrounding villages as a man of modest means but immeasurable integrity. He drove a weathered Peugeot 500 for that groaned on every red laterite road, sold provisions from a small shop near the motor park, and worshipped at St. Augustine's Catholic Church every Sunday without fail. His wife Ngozi was a seamstress, a woman with slender fingers gifted enough to conjure beautiful Asook and Ankara designs that women traveled from distant towns to purchase. For 7 long years after their marriage, Emeka and Ngozi had no child. 7 years of prayers that rose like incense from their lips every morning and every night. 7 years of visiting the parish priest, of long vigils at the adoration ministry in Enugu, of herbal concoctions from the old medicine woman at the edge of town, of whispered gossip from neighbors who wondered aloud whether Ngozi's womb had been locked by her enemies. In Igbo land, a childless union invites questions that can cut deeper than any blade, and though Emeka never wavered in his love for Ngozi, the weight of those 7 barren years pressed upon them like harmattan dust on a still afternoon. Then, on the 14th day of February, the day the world calls Valentine's Day, though in Oguta it was simply a warm Thursday, Ngozi went into labor at the General Hospital and pushed not once but twice. The first cry pierced the delivery room. The nurses looked at each other. Then the second cry followed, fierce and full-lunged as if announcing a conquest. Twins. 2 baby girls, identical in every measurable way, same round cheeks, same perfectly shaped heads, same milk-dark skin, same fingers curled like tiny fern fronds. When the nurse held them up side by side, and Emeka looked through the glass with tears streaming freely down his face, he could not tell which baby he had seen first. He rushed inside, grabbed Ngozi's hand, and wept like a man released from prison. The firstborn, arriving by a mere 4 minutes, was named Des Okafor. The name meant daughter of the king, and it was given to honor the king-like grace of her rival. The second was named Chidinma Okafor. The name meant God is good, and no name had ever been more perfectly chosen, for God had indeed been exceedingly good to the Okafor household on that Valentine's Thursday. The celebration that followed lasted 3 days. Emeka slaughtered 2 goats. His kinsmen drank palm wine until the clay pots were empty. Ngozi's mother came from Asoba and danced in the compound until her wrapper threatened to fall. Even the old Dibia who lived beyond the stream, a man who rarely smiled, came and said quietly, "These children carry youth. They carry light. Wherever they go, abundance will follow." No one knew then how profoundly and how dangerously true those words would become. Children of fortune from the very first week the twins were brought home from the hospital. Strange and wonderful things began to happen. Ngozi carried both babies to the market one afternoon, nestled in a double wrapper tied across her chest and back in the traditional Igbo style, 1 child before and 1 behind. She had gone simply to buy crayfish and dried stockfish, but as she walked through the Oguta main market, stall owners began calling out to her not to sell, but to give. Mama Kioma, who sold tomatoes, pressed a full basket into her hands. Old Oga the butcher gave her a large chunk of goat meat wrapped in banana leaf. The woman who sold groundnuts poured a generous measure into Ngozi's bag without being asked. "These children," Mama Kioma said softly, touching the head of little Ades, "they carry at Chuwa. Good fortune. Anyone who blesses them will be blessed." It was not superstition. It was observable fact. Wherever the twins went, people gave freely. Taxi drivers refused to collect fare when the babies were in the car. The landlord, inexplicably, reduced their rent by half. A distant relative in Lagos who had not spoken to Emeka in 11 years suddenly sent a money transfer of 50,000 naira with no explanation other than, "I had a dream about your family. God told me to send this." As the girls grew from infants into toddlers, into school-age children, the pattern continued. Money seemed to flow toward the family whenever Ades and Chidinma were present. Their parents, who had struggled for years, began to prosper. Emeka expanded his provision shop into a full supermarket. Ngozi's tailoring business attracted a wealthy clientele from Owerri and Port Harcourt. They moved from their modest rented rooms to a proper compound house with a borehole, a generator, and a satellite dish, the markers of true prosperity in Oguta. The twins themselves were aware, in the vague way that children sense things without fully understanding them, that they were special. But what made them truly remarkable was not their good fortune, it was their perfect, total, absolute sameness. Ades and Chidinma were identical in a manner that went far beyond ordinary twin resemblance. They were not merely similar. They were duplicates, like two prints from the same photographic negative. Same height, always, year after year. Same weight, as if their bodies had agreed to grow at precisely the same rate. Same gap-toothed smile. Same voice, the same musical lilt that made every sentence sound like the beginning of a song. Same laugh, a bright, cascading sound that turned heads in every room they entered. Their mother, afraid that people would one day confuse them to their disadvantage, had pierced Chidinma's right ear with a second hole as an infant, a small distinguishing mark. But that single detail was so subtle that even those who knew about it often forgot to check. Their own father, Emeka, admitted once to a close friend over a bottle of Obinquo that he had more than once called the wrong daughter by the wrong name, and only realized his error when the girl corrected him with a laugh. They wore the same clothes. This was partly their mother's doing. She sewed identical outfits for them from the same fabric, considering it beautiful and traditional, and partly the girl's own insistence. Ades and Chidinma preferred to be dressed alike. They felt, they would later explain, that their sameness was their strength. Their identity was not individual. It was collective. They were not Ades and Chidinma. They were the twins. In primary school, their teachers gave up trying to tell them apart and simply called both of them twin when addressing either one. Their classmates regarded them with a mixture of awe and gentle frustration. Games were played involving the twins where their friends tried to correctly identify who was who, and almost no one ever got it right. Only their mother could tell them apart with absolute certainty, and she claimed that even with her eyes closed, she could feel the difference in the way their hands felt in hers. A Daisy's hand, she said, was always slightly warmer. Chidinma's was slightly cooler. The girls found this claim deeply romantic and never tried to test whether it was true. They did everything together. They read the same books. They liked the same food, ofonagbu with semolina, akara with ogi in the mornings, suya on Friday evenings. They sang in the same church choir, harmonizing so naturally that the choirmaster once said listening to them was like hearing one voice multiply itself. They played the same games, made the same grades and near-perfect scores across the board, and won the same prizes at school competitions. When Ades won Best Student in Primary 6, Chidinma won Best All-Rounder in the same year, so they each went home with a trophy of equal size. They even fell sick at the same time. Twice they both developed malaria simultaneously, their fevers rising and breaking on the same schedule, as if their bodies had synchronized their illness like synchronized swimmers in a pool. Their father began to believe, with the quiet certainty of a man who has seen too many coincidences to call them coincidences anymore, that his daughters were not merely twins, they were two halves of a single spiritual entity that had been divided at birth for reasons only God could explain. Their secondary school years at Oguta Girls' Secondary School were more of the same: brilliance, laughter, shared wardrobes, shared everything. The other students admired them. Boys from the nearby boys' school would find excuses to pass in front of their school gate just for a glimpse of the twins who were beautiful and identical, and utterly untouchable in their self-sufficiency. And then came university. The University of Nigeria, Nsukka. Both girls gained admission to study mass communication, scoring the same marks on JNB as if they had taken the exam with connected minds. In Nsukka, they shared a room in the female hostel, shared textbooks, shared their small cooking pot, shared their worries and their dreams. Their friendship was the most complete friendship either of them had ever known, simply because they were each other's most intimate mirror. It was in their third year at Nsukka that things, slowly, imperceptibly at first, began to change. The fracture begins. His name was Obinna Ikechukwueze, and he arrived at the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, as a transfer student from the Federal University of Technology, Owerri, where he had studied mechanical engineering for 2 years before switching to pursue petroleum engineering at ON. He was tall in the way that Igbo men of good lineage sometimes are, broad-shouldered, with a jaw that seemed carved from the same mahogany wood that Igbo craftsmen use for their finest sculptures. He had deep-set eyes that held a calm, searching intelligence, and he walked with a quiet confidence that did not announce itself noisily but was simply present. Obinna Ez came from a wealthy family in Nui. His father, Chief Cyprian Ez, was a major importer of automotive parts, one of Nui's famous traders who had built an empire from nothing and now drove a black Mercedes G-Wagon that the whole town recognized. Obinna, despite this background of wealth, was not spoiled. His father had made sure of that. He wore simple clothes, cooked his own food in his off-campus apartment, and spent his weekends reading or watching football. He had goals to complete his degree, work in the oil sector, and eventually set up his own engineering consultancy. He met Ades Okafor at the Faculty of Arts common room, where she had gone to return a borrowed journal. She was wearing a yellow Ankara blouse and dark blue jeans, her hair in neat cornrows, and she was arguing loudly with a library staff member about a fine she believed was unfairly charged. Obinna found himself listening to her argue, watching the way her eyes flashed. The precise Igbo-inflected English she wielded like a weapon, and he found himself smiling before he even knew her name. He introduced himself. She told him her name. He offered to pay her fine as a joke. She looked at him as if he had suggested something deeply offensive, paid the fine herself with crisp Naira notes drawn from a small purse, and walked out. He went back the next day. And the day after that. By the fourth visit, Ades had decided she liked him. She told Chidinma that night in their room, her voice trying hard to be casual and failing completely. "There is this boy," she said, examining her fingernails with exaggerated indifference. "He is from Nui. His name is Obinna." Chidinma looked at her sister with the particular attention that only a twin can give, reading not just the words but the tremor beneath them, the slight brightness in their eyes, the controlled smile threatening to break loose. "Ades," she said simply, "you like him." "I said there is this boy, you like him, Ades." A pause. Then Ades buried her face in her pillow and let out a sound that was halfway between a groan and a laugh. Chidinma laughed. She felt happy for her sister. She did. She told herself she did. And she was right to feel happy, because Ades was radiant with early love in a way that was beautiful to witness. Even Chidinma, who shared everything with her sister, could see that this was something new and real and good. But beneath the genuine happiness, like a rock hidden beneath the surface of a still river, something else stirred into Chidinma. Something she would not name for a long time, not yet. Obinna and Ades began spending time together. Walks around the campus, evenings at the kiosk near the engineering faculty sharing suya and cold drinks. Study sessions in the library that lasted longer than strictly necessary. The relationship developed slowly, carefully, with the dignity of two people who were serious about each other from the beginning. Chidinma met Obinna for the first time 3 weeks into this budding romance, when Ades brought him to their room. Obinna was polite, warm, and genuinely delighted to meet Adesi's famous twin. He looked from one sister to the other with undisguised amazement. "You are truly identical," he said, shaking his head with a laugh. "I can see why people struggle. If I did not know Adesi's cornrows, I would not know which of you is which right now." Ades laughed. "You will learn. The longer you know me, the more differences you will find." Obinna looked at her with warm eyes. "I will take that as a promise." Chidinma smiled. "Welcome to the family," she said lightly. But that night, after Urbina had gone and Ades was in the bathroom, Chidinma sat on her bed in the dark and felt the stone under the river shift. She could not explain it. She did not try. She simply sat with the feeling and told herself it would pass. It did not pass. The weight of sameness. By the time the rainy season arrived, heavy and tropical and smelling of damp earth, Urbina and Ades were fully, officially, deeply in a relationship. They were the kind of couple that people called serious not because they were stern, but because their bond had the density of something built to last. Urbina brought Ades to church with him on Sundays. Ades helped Urbina study for his petroleum thermodynamics exam. They cooked together in his apartment, laughed together, argued about small things and resolved them with the ease of people who trust each other. Chidinma watched all of this. She was happy for Ades. She said this to herself every morning, when she woke and saw her sister's face glowing with a particular light that love gives to young women. She said it at night when Ades whispered details about Urbina, what he had said, what he had done, how he had looked at her, with the breathless joy of someone who still cannot believe their luck. Chidinma listened, offered the right comments, said the right things. But inside, and Chidinma would spend years refusing to name this feeling, burying it beneath smiles and affirmations inside, she was drowning. The problem was simple and devastating. All her life, she and Ades had been the same. In all things, they had been equal. They had walked together every road, climbed every hill side by side, received every blessing in tandem. Their sameness was not merely physical. It was existential. It was the foundation of Chidinma's entire identity. She did not know how to be herself without also being a Daisy's twin. She did not know how to have something that Ades did not also have. And now Ades had love. Chidinma had tried. She had spoken to boys on campus. She had attended mixers. She had sat across from young men at cafeteria tables and waited to feel what Ades described, that particular electricity, that breathless recognition. Nothing came. The boys she met were nice, or boring, or interested in her face rather than her mind. One tried to date her primarily because she was a Daisy's twin and seemed to find the idea of identical twins romantically exciting, in a way that offended Chidinma deeply. She was, in the cruel social accounting of campus life, single. And Ades was not. The thought that grew in Chidinma's mind, dark, quiet, persistent, was not that Ades should lose her love. She was not that kind of woman. She would never have wished Urbina away. No. The thought was simpler and more dangerous. I should have this too. Not love in general, this specific love, this man, these feelings that Ades describes. She began to pay closer attention to Urbina. Studying him the way she had once studied textbooks, cataloging his habits, his preferences, the way he laughed, the particular dimple that appeared on his left cheek. She noted that he liked his pepper soup on the spicy side. She noted that he preferred Afrobeats to hip-hop when he cooked. She noted that he was patient, that he listened well, that he had the kind of quiet strength she had always without knowing it wanted in a man. And she noted, with a clarity that should have alarmed her but instead sent a slow shiver of excitement down her spine, he could not tell them apart. She had discovered this by accident. One afternoon, Ades had asked Chidinma to drop something off at Urbina's apartment, a textbook she had borrowed from him. Chidinma went. Urbina opened the door, saw her face, and smiled with the warmth he reserved for Ades. "I was just thinking about you," he said. "Come in." Chidinma stood at the doorway, the textbook in her hand, and made a choice she would carry for years. She said nothing to correct him. She stepped inside. She sat on his couch. For 20 minutes, she answered his questions as Ades would have answered them, laughed at his jokes as Ades would have laughed, accepted the cup of tea he made as if she were his girlfriend coming home. When she finally said she had to go and handed him the textbook, his confusion was brief and passing. He assumed Ades had forgotten something and quickly retrieved it. He walked her to the door. He touched her hand as she left. Chidinma walked back to her hostel with her heart beating so loudly she could hear it. She did not tell Ades what had happened. She told herself it was nothing, a misunderstanding, it meant nothing, but she went back. The second time was more deliberate. Ades was at a group meeting for a media law assignment that would last at least 2 hours. Chidinma dressed in the same clothes Ades had been wearing earlier that day. They shared wardrobes, so this was simple. She went to Obina's apartment. He opened the door and this time she did not wait for him to speak first. Obina, I just wanted to see you. He smiled and pulled her inside. They sat together. He played music. He told her about his day. She told him about hers. Daisy's day, actually, assembled from what Ades had mentioned that morning. He held her hand as they sat, and she felt everything she had envied, everything she had craved, ripple through her like warm current. When he leaned close to her face, she did not pull back. They kissed. It was brief. It was warm. And it undid something in Chidinma that had been wound tight for too long. She left before Ades could return. She went back to their room, showered, changed her clothes, and sat on her bed with her hands folded in her lap, looking at nothing. She was not proud of herself. But she was not, if she was honest, fully ashamed either. She told herself it was an experiment. She told herself it would not happen again. It happened again. Over the following months, Chidinma found moments, carefully orchestrated moments when Ades was away, occupied, absent, to slip into her sister's identity and spend time with Obina. She was meticulous about it. She studied Daisy's speech patterns, her specific jokes, her particular way of rolling her eyes when she was amused, the topics she cared most deeply about. Chidinma was, after all, the person who knew Ades most completely. She was Daisy's mirror. Impersonating her was not difficult. It was, disturbingly, almost natural. Obina never once suspected. He was a clever man, a man of science and reason, and yet reason had no purchase here. When the face of the woman he loved appeared before him, his mind did not go to the space of doubt. It went to warmth. It went to recognition. It went home. They kissed more than once. He held her. He talked to her with the tender openness he reserved for Ades. He made her feel, for those stolen hours, like she was loved. And Chidinma, standing in the ruins of her own integrity, thought, is it really so wrong? She is my twin, I am her. We are the same. What I feel with him is real, even if he does not know it is me he is feeling it with. She was wrong. She knew she was wrong. But she was also desperate, and desperation is a poor guide to moral clarity. Meanwhile, Ades, a glowing, trusting, wholly in love, suspected nothing. She came home from her meetings and assignments and found Chidinma on her bed reading a novel. The very picture of a contented sister spending a quiet evening alone. And felt only gratitude that she had such a stable, supportive twin in her life. The ring. The proposal came in their final year, on a warm October evening in 2019. At a restaurant in Enugu where Obina had booked a private table decorated with white candles and the kind of fresh flowers there. Tea had to be specially ordered from Abuja. The Macta D had been briefed. The champagne was all ready. Chilled. Obina waited until the main course was done and then he reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small velvet box. He opened it. Inside was a ring, 18-karat gold with a princess cut diamond that caught the candlelight. And scattered it in tiny arrows across the white tablecloth. It was not ostentatious. It was exactly right. Ades Okafor, he said, his voice steady with the particular steadiness of a man who has rehearsed what he wants to say and now means every word. From the first day you argued with that library staff, I knew you were someone I could not walk past. Every day I have spent with you has convinced me more completely that I want to spend every other day of my life trying to be worthy of you. Will you be my wife? Ades said yes. She said it before he finished the sentence, actually. She said it with tears she had not planned on, grabbing his hands across the table, nodding so vigorously the candlelight flickered. The other diners at the restaurant, who had been watching from the corners of their eyes, burst into applause. She called Chidinma from the restaurant bathroom, voice breathless and fractured with joy. Kai. Kai, he proposed. He proposed, Kai, are you listening to me? He proposed. Chidinma, sitting in their room at Tsuka, heard every word with the kind of precise attention that people give to news they have been dreading. She pressed the phone against her ear. She felt the world crystallize on her into a terrible, brilliant clarity. "Congratulations," she said. And her voice was perfectly, impeccably warm. "I am so happy for you, Ada. I am so happy for you." She hung up. She put the phone face down on the bed. She pressed both hands flat against the mattress, breathing slowly, steadily, methodically, like a diver preparing to go very deep. Then she picked up a pillow, pressed it against her face, and screamed into it until her throat was raw. The plan that grew in the dark. After the engagement, the wedding planning began in earnest. Emeka and Ngozi were delirious with happiness. Chief Ciprianes and his wife made the journey from Nui to Oguta for the formal Dijianakwa, the traditional marriage ceremony, and it was an affair that the town talked about for weeks afterward. The bride price was agreed upon after the proper ritual negotiations. Prayers were offered, the palm wine was carried by Ades to Obinna in the ceremony of acceptance, and by the end of that day, in the eyes of Igbo tradition, Ades and Obinna were already married in the most essential, ancestral sense. The church wedding was scheduled for the 22nd of March, White Wedding, as Nigerians called it, St. Augustine's Catholic Church. Oguta, the same church where Ades and Chidinma had been baptized, where they had received their first communion, where they had celebrated every significant moment of their spiritual lives. Chidinma was named chief bridesmaid. She threw herself into the role with an intensity that everyone around her read as love and dedication and big sisterly excitement, and she was all of those things. She loved Ades. She would have died for Ades, and yet, in the deep and unlit basement of her heart, the plan was already forming. It had not arrived all at once. It had crept in the way mold creeps across bread, slowly, invisibly, and then suddenly everywhere. She had told herself, when the proposal happened, that she would finally let go. She had told herself that the kisses and the stolen hours with Obinna meant nothing, would mean nothing, once Ades was properly married and she herself had moved on. She had told herself many things. But the engagement ring on a Daisy's finger was a tangible thing, and every time Chidinma saw it flash in the light, she felt the stone under the river turn to a grinding weight. The thought came to her one night at 3 in the morning, when she woke from a dream she could not remember, but that had left her chest full of a grief too large to name. What if I was her? Not metaphorically. Not in the vague, sisterly way of I am with her. But literally. What if, on the wedding day, I was Ades? What if I wore the dress? What if I stood at the altar? What if I said the words? She dismissed the thought immediately. It was absurd. It was criminal. It was a betrayal of everything she held sacred. She thought about it again the next night. And the night after that. By the time the first flowers were ordered for the wedding and the cake was being designed at a bakery in Owerri, Chidinma had ceased dismissing the thought. She had begun, instead, to examine it. To turn it over the way one turns a fruit, to examine it for bruises. To test its weight, its texture, its feasibility. By the time the bridal gown, ivory silk, long trained, hand embroidered with silver thread by a designer in Lagos, arrived and was hung on a Daisy's wardrobe door, Chidinma had a plan. It was a terrible plan. She knew it was terrible. She was an educated woman, a woman of faith, a woman who knew the difference between right and wrong as clearly as she knew the difference between north and south. And she had a plan anyway. Because she was also a woman who had spent 23 years being the same as someone else, and the first time she had touched something that was uniquely hers, even if it was stolen, she had not been able to put it down. The plan required 3 things: timing, a location, and someone she could trust. For timing, she had been observing the schedule of the wedding day with the attention of a general studying a battlefield. She knew that Ades would be alone in her bridal suite at the Oguta Royal Hotel from 7 to 8 in the morning. The period between when her mother left to dress and when the bridesmaids arrived to begin preparation. 1 hour. 1 hour was enough. For a location, she had already identified an empty room in her parents' house, a storeroom at the back that was kept locked, that had a padlock on its heavy wooden door. That was cool and dark and could hold a person for a day without anyone knowing. She had made a copy of the key the previous week under the pretense of needing to retrieve something from it. For someone she could trust, she trusted no one. Which meant she would do it alone. The thought of what she was about to do occasionally woke her at night with a lurch of horror that left her sitting up in bed, damp with sweat, whispering her sister's name. But she always found her way back to the dark logic she had constructed. This is the only way. Obinna cannot tell us apart. He loves me too. Those kisses, that tenderness, those hours, some of that was for me. I am not stealing a Daisy's husband. I am claiming what is already partly mine. She was wrong. She knew she was wrong. And she planned anyway. The morning that split the world. The 22nd of March arrived on a morning so beautiful it seemed designed by someone with a fondness for irony. The sky over Aguta was a clean, cloudless blue. The air carried the scent of blooming frangipanis from the church garden. Church bells at St. Augustine's had already rung once in preliminary joy. Women in colorful asoak were arriving from neighboring compounds, ululating softly, their laughter carrying across the morning air like music. Adès Okof awoke at 5 o'clock, in her bridal suite, at the Aguta Royal Hotel with a heart so full of happiness she could barely breathe. She lay on the white hotel sheets in the early morning dark, smiling at the ceiling, tracing the shape of her future with quiet fingers. Today she would become Mrs. Adès. Today she would walk down the aisle of the church where she had been baptized, toward the man she loved, in front of everyone she loved. Today was the most perfect day of her life. Her mother came at 6, brisk and weeping simultaneously in the way of Igbo mothers at their daughters' weddings. They embraced for a long time without speaking. Ngozi brushed Daisy's hair and pressed her palms against her daughter's cheeks and said, "You are beautiful. You have always been beautiful. Go and be happy." Then Ngozi left to dress herself, promising to return with the bridesmaids at 8. It was 7 o'clock. Adès was alone. She had just opened her makeup bag and was examining her reflection in the bridal mirror when the knock came at the door. She assumed it was the hotel staff. She went to the door in her robe and opened it. Chidinma stood in the corridor. She was dressed for travel, not for a wedding. Jeans, a simple top, flat shoes. Her face was composed but her eyes held something that Adès had never seen in them before, a flatness, a wall, a door firmly shut. "Kai," Adès frowned. "What are you doing here? You look. Why are you dressed like that?" "The ceremony." "Come in," Chidinma said. "I need to show you something. It is about the wedding." "Something is wrong, Ada." "Come inside." Adès, whose trust in her twin was as automatic as breathing, stepped back to let her in. She did not see what Chidinma was holding until the door was closed behind them. She did not have time to scream. What happened in that room in the next few minutes, Chidinma would spend the rest of her life trying not to remember clearly. There was a cloth soaked in something that made Adès go slack and heavy. There was the careful work of binding hands and feet with soft rope. Chidinma had made sure it was not rope that would mark the skin, had made sure of that detail at least. There was the blindfold. There was the silence of a hotel corridor at 7 in the morning, when everyone was occupied elsewhere. There was Chidinma, carrying her sister's dead weight through the service exit that she had memorized, into the car she had parked in the side lot 2 days earlier, and driving to their parents' house. There was the storeroom, the padlock, the darkness. And there was Chidinma, driving back to the hotel in the rising morning light with her hands steady on the wheel and her heart divided, the part that screamed being held under by the part that had mad. Each decision. She walked back into the bridal suite. She stood in front of the mirror. She put on her sister's wedding gown. It fit perfectly. Of course it did. They were the same. The wedding St. Augustine's Catholic Church was filled to its generous capacity and beyond. Folding chairs had been placed in the aisles. Children sat on laps. The organ filled the vaulted interior with music that rose to the ceiling and fell over the congregation like warm rain. Flowers, white lilies and cream roses decorated every pew. The wedding had been anticipated for months, and Aguta had shown up in full, magnificent force. Obinna stood at the altar in his white wedding suit with a cream-colored tie, hands clasped before him, watching the church doors with the unguarded expression of a man at the summit of his happiness. His best man, Ikenna, stood beside him. His father, Chief Cyprian Ez, occupied the front row with his wife. Immaculate and proud, the wedding march began, the doors opened, and Chidinma, in her sister's ivory gown, her sister's veil, her sister's shoes, holding her sister's bouquet of white and cream flowers, walked down the aisle of St. Augustine's Catholic Church toward the man her sister loved. She walked slowly. She held her face in the precise configuration of joy and solemnity that a bride is expected to wear. She had studied Daisy's mannerisms for 23 years. She did not stumble. She did not falter. She walked the aisle as Adez would have walked it, with grace, with dignity, with the quiet confidence of a woman arriving at the moment she was made for. Every person in that church saw Adez Okafor walking toward her groom. Not a single person knew they were wrong. Obinna looked at her face as she came to him, and the expression that crossed his features was one of profound, settled love, the look of a man who has already decided and is now simply, gratefully experiencing the confirmation. He reached out and took her hands. "You look beautiful," he whispered. "Thank you," Chidinma said. His hands were warm, strong. She held them. The priest began. She said the responses. She held the ring as it was placed on her finger. She heard the prayers and the scripture and the congregation's periodic amens. She stood in the light coming through the stained glass windows and felt it fall across her face and told herself over and over in the white noise beneath the ceremony, that this was right. That this was where she belonged. When the priest said, "You may now kiss your bride," Obinna lifted the veil, looked at her face with gentle eyes, and kissed her softly. Chidinma closed her eyes. The church erupted in celebration. She was married. There was only one moment, in all the ceremonies that followed, the signing of the register, the photographs outside the church, the reception, when anything threatened to pierce the seal of her performance. Obinna leaned close to her during the reception and said, with a smile, "I noticed your twin is not here. I looked for her during the ceremony. Where is Chidinma?" Chidinma did not miss a beat. She had prepared for this question. She had a small emergency, she said. A health issue. She sends her love. She will come and see us tomorrow. Obinna's brow creased in brief concern. "I hope she is all right. I would have liked her to be here. She is practically family. She will be fine," Chidinma said. And she smiled the smile of a woman who is holding herself together with both hands and has no intention of letting go. The new life. She moved into Obinna's apartment in Enugu, the apartment he had prepared for his wife with new furniture, and fresh paint and curtains that Adez had chosen herself from an Enugu market. Chidinma stood in the doorway of that apartment on their first night as a married couple, and looked at the curtains, burgundy with gold thread, a Daisy's favorite colors, and felt the full weight of what she had done press against her chest. Like a physical thing. She breathed through it. She crossed the threshold. She was here now. There was no going back. Living as Adez was both easier and harder than she had expected. Easier because Obinna, for all his intelligence, did not look for differences. He looked for the woman he loved, found her familiar face, heard her familiar voice, and was satisfied. He did not probe, he did not test, he simply loved. And harder because Chidinma had to maintain, every day, every hour, the performance of being someone else. She had to remember Daisy's preferences when ordering food. She had to remember her sister's opinions on matters she and Adez disagreed about. She had to catch herself using phrases that were distinctly her own constructions, rhythms, references that Adez would not use, and edit herself constantly. She called her parents occasionally, playing the role of a happy new bride, letting them hear what they expected to hear. Her mother's voice, each time, held the particular warmth of a woman satisfied that her daughter was settled and joyful. Meanwhile, in the locked storeroom at the back of her parents' house in Oguta, Adez lay bound and blindfolded in the dark. Chidinma had left food, crackers, water, small things that could sustain a person without needing to be opened by someone with bound hands, items she had partially opened and placed within reach. She had ensured the rope was not too tight. She had made sure, she told herself this repeatedly, that her sister was not in physical danger, just contained. just prevented, temporarily, from interfering. The plan had always included a release. Chidinma was not a monster. She was a woman who had made a terrible, catastrophic decision, but she was not a monster. She had told herself from the beginning that once she was pregnant, once there was a child, a proof of the new life, an anchor that could not be pulled up, she would release Adez. Let her be found. Let the world adjust to the new reality. She threw herself into being Obina's wife with a ferocity that was part love and part guilt. She cooked his favorite meals with new skill. She was tender with him in ways that were both genuine and performed. She prayed, and this was not performance, this was real, raw, desperate prayer for forgiveness from a God she still believed in despite the magnitude of what she had done. 3 months into the marriage, she missed her cycle. 4 weeks later, the pregnancy test was positive. She sat on the bathroom floor of their Enugu apartment, the white stick in her hand, and cried. Not from happiness, or not only from happiness. She cried from the full, accumulated weight of everything she had done and could not undo. She cried for Adez, alone in that darkness, waiting. She cried for Obina, who deserved truth. She cried for herself, for the woman she had been before the stone under the river had grown heavy enough to pull her down. Then she picked up her phone and called her parents' neighbor, an elderly man she had paid in advance for exactly this moment, and told him the storeroom door at the back of the Okafor compound should be unlocked. Tell no one, she said. Just open it. She hung up. She put the phone face down on the tile floor of the bathroom. She pressed both hands over the tiny, invisible beginning of a life inside her and sat in the white fluorescence of the bathroom light for a long time. The door was opening. Adez was being set free. And now everything would break. The woman who returned. What Adez experienced in that storeroom was a darkness so complete it seemed physical, not merely the absence of light, but a presence of its own, a solid and breathing thing. She had woken from the drug that Chidinma had used with a head that felt stuffed with cotton, her mouth dry as chalk, her hands bound, the blindfold pressing against her eyes. For the first hours, she had believed she was dreaming. Then she had believed she was dead. Then, slowly, as consciousness reassembled itself, she had begun to understand. Chidinma. The realization had arrived not as a shock, but as a sorrow so deep it had no flaw. She had not screamed, there was no one to hear her. She had not struggled wildly. The ropes, though not cruel, were effective. She had lain in the darkness and breathed, and thought, and understood. She counted days by the cycles of hunger and the rhythm of her sleep, though without light these were imprecise instruments. She ate the small things Chidinma had left. She prayed. She thought about Obina, about what was happening on the day that was supposed to be the best day of her life. She thought about her mother. She thought about Chidinma not with rage, not yet, but with a grief that was older and stranger than rage. The grief of someone who has discovered that the person they most trusted is also the person capable of their deepest wound. When the storeroom door finally opened and the evening light poured in, even the mild, orange-tinted light of a Raguta evening felt blinding after so long. She blinked and blinked until the world assembled itself. The neighbor, old Papa Obasi, found her sitting against the wall of the storeroom, her hair disordered, her clothes stained, her face bearing the particular hollowness of someone who has spent a long time in the dark with their own thoughts. He untied her hands with shaking fingers, his voice breaking as he called her name. She asked him one question: how many days? He told her. She closed her eyes. She did the calculation. Then she stood up, and though her legs were stiff and her body protested every movement, she walked through her parents' house empty. Her parents were not home, and out through the gate and onto the road, and she flagged down an Okada motorcycle and told the rider to take her to the bus park. She did not stop to change. She did not stop to wash. She went. She arrived at Obina's apartment in Enugu on an afternoon when the air was heavy with the threat of rain. She had his address, she had always had it. She climbed the stairs on legs that trembled with equal parts weakness and purpose, and she knocked. Obina opened the door. He saw her face, the same face he had kissed at the altar, the same face he woke beside each morning, but different in the way that matters most, unkempt, wounded. wearing clothes that were not wedding clothes, eyes that held a light he had not seen in his apartment. A confused recognition moved across his features. Adez, he said, then slowly, the confusion deepening. How I am Adez, she said. Her voice was quiet and absolutely steady. I am your girlfriend. I am the woman you were supposed to marry. I need you to let me in. Behind him, from the kitchen, came the sound of something being set down on a counter, then the sound of footsteps. And then Chidinma appeared in the doorway of the kitchen, wearing an apron, her face going from its everyday expression to something Adez had never seen on it before, an expression that held, in layers, guilt and fear and love and a terror so complete it nearly looked like grief. The three of them stood in that terrible triangle for a moment that seemed to last longer than all the months that had preceded it. Then Adez looked at her twin sister, this woman who shared her blood and her face and the first 23 years of her life, and said, very quietly, "What did you do, Chidinma?" The truth that breaks things open. Obinna had always been a man of precision. His discipline of petroleum engineering had trained him to deal with facts, temperatures, pressures, the measurable behavior of substances under specific conditions. He was not a man who tolerated ambiguity easily, and he was not a man whose mind moved slowly when confronted with evidence. The evidence before him was precise and devastating. He looked at the woman in the doorway, the woman he had been living with as his wife, and he looked at the woman who had just arrived. And he saw in the arriving woman something that the doorway woman had never quite given him. A rawness, a damage, the specific disarray of someone who had been through something terrible. He looked at the arriving woman's wrists and saw the faint marks where rope had been. He looked at her face and saw that her eyes, though steady, were the eyes of someone who had been in darkness. Then he turned to the woman in the apron. She did not speak. She did not have to. "It was you," he said, and his voice was not raised. It was quiet in the way that the sky goes quiet before a storm, not because there is no power but because power is being gathered. Chidinma lifted her chin. Her hands were trembling, but her face, in those first moments, held the remnant of her long performance, the control, the composure that had carried her through months of deception. Then Adez said her name again, just her name, just Chidinma, and something in the precision of it, the knowledge embedded in the syllables, the grief and the love mixed together, cracked the composure open. Chidinma began to cry. She told the truth. All of it. She told it in the stumbling, jagged way that truth comes out when it has been compressed for a long time, not in order, not cleanly, but all there, all present, everything that had happened from the moment she first sat in Obinna's apartment pretending to be her sister to the moment she had opened that hotel room door on the morning of the wedding. She told them about the kisses. She told them about the storeroom. She told them about the pregnancy. At the mention of the pregnancy, Obinna's face went through a series of expressions so rapidly that they blurred into each other. Then he set his jaw and went very still. Adez, during this telling, sat down on the couch. She sat very straight, very still, like a woman in prayer who is trying to hear something that is being spoken to quietly. She looked at her sister and did not look away, and the expression on her face was not the one Chidinma had feared most. It was not fury, pure and cleansing. It was something more complicated. It was the face of a woman processing the discovery that the person she has loved most completely and the world is capable of something she would never, in 23 years, have imagined. When Chidinma finished, the apartment was silent except for the sound of rain beginning outside and Chidinma's uneven breathing. Adez said, "You could have told me, Kai. You could have come to me. You could have said I am in love with your man, or even just I am lonely, I am in pain, I cannot bear to watch you have something I do not have. You could have said any of those things to me. I would have listened. I have always listened to you. Did you forget that?" Chidinma pressed her fist against her mouth. She could not speak. "Instead you locked me in a room," Adez said. "In the dark. On my wedding day. My own wedding day, Kai." "I know," Chidinma whispered. "You know," Adez repeated. Then she turned away from her sister and looked at Obinna. Obinna was looking at her. His eyes held the specific anguish of a man who has just realized that the months he thought he was living have been something else entirely, that the intimacy, the mornings, the nights, The conversations he had had with his wife in their apartment had been with a woman who was not the woman he loved. "I am sorry," he said to Adez. "I am so sorry. I did not know. I swear to you I did not know." "I know you did not know," Adez said softly. "How could you have known?" "I should have. How? We are identical, Obinna. Even our own father sometimes calls us by the wrong name. How could you have known when she did everything she could to make sure you would not know?" She paused. "This is not your fault." He came to her. He knelt in front of her, on the floor of his apartment, the man who had married the wrong twin because the right twin had been bound in a storeroom, and he took her hands in his and held them the way a person holds something very important they nearly lost. "What do we do?" he asked. And that was the question that would take months to answer. The reckoning and the rebuild. What followed was a season of the most brutal honesty Oguta had ever seen produced from one family. The first order of business was the truth told to their parents. Emeka and Ngozi arrived at Obinna's apartment the following day, summoned by a call from Adez that had given nothing away except that something had happened and they needed to come. Chief Ciprianez and his wife came from Nui. Chidinma told her parents herself. She stood in Obinna's sitting room with the four parents arranged in seats before her and she told the entire story again, from beginning to end. She did not spare herself. She told it completely. The silence that followed was the longest silence any of them had ever sat in. Then Emeka Okafor, a man who had spent his life being gentle, stood up from his chair and walked to the window and stood with his back to the room for several minutes. When he turned around, his face held an expression that Chidinma had never seen on it, not anger, not grief exactly, but a profound, exhausted sorrow. The sorrow of a father who has looked at his daughter and seen a stranger. "Chidinma," he said, "you have broken something today. I am not sure it can be fixed." Ngozi wept. Chief Ez sat very still and said nothing. His wife put her arm round Ngozi. The legal and practical complications were navigated in the weeks that followed. The marriage certificate that bore a Daisy's name, but Chidinma's signature, was the subject of urgent discussions with a solicitor from Owerri. Religious annulments were considered, sought, processed. St. Augustine's was consulted, and the parish priest, once told what had occurred, responded with a devastated pastoral care that was deeply sincere. But the central question, the one that sat in the middle of every conversation like a stone no one could move, was the pregnancy. Chidinma was carrying Obinna's child. Obinna did not deny it and did not flinch from it. He had, in the months he had spent living with who he thought was his wife, been fully, faithfully committed to her. There had been no carelessness, no recklessness. He had been a husband, without knowing the woman he was being a husband to. And the result of that was a life that was beginning, and that life was his responsibility, his and Chidinma's. Adez, who had every right to wash her hands of everything connected to Chidinma and Obinna and the whole catastrophic situation, surprised everyone, including herself, with the clarity of what she said next. "I want Obinna," she said, sitting at the family meeting that gathered both sets of parents and all three central figures. "I want the marriage we planned. I want the life we planned." And Obinna, she looked at him, and he looked back with eyes that had not left her face since she arrived at his door. "I believe he wants that too." "Yes," Obinna said immediately. "Then we will marry. Properly this time." And Chidinma's child. She paused, and in that pause, those who were watching her face saw something that was not easy or simple but was deeply, startlingly real, a grace larger than what she had any right to be expected to show. Chidinma's child will be born and will be cared for. Obinna is the father. That is a fact. And I will not be the reason a child is born without its father. The room was silent again. Then Ngozi whispered, "Adez." "I am not doing this for Chidinma," Adez said, without looking at her twin. "I am doing this because it is right." In Igbo tradition, the taking of a second wife, while uncommon in modern practice and specifically forbidden in Catholic faith, was not without cultural precedent. And the particular circumstances of this situation were so extraordinary that even the parish priest, when privately consulted, acknowledged that God's mercy was wide and human situations were complex, and the pastoral priority was the care of all people involved, including an unborn child. The legal and religious frameworks that would govern the arrangement were worked out carefully, prayerfully, over several months. Obinna and Ades were properly married, a small ceremony, no fanfare, witnessed by their parents and to friends on a Thursday morning in July, 4 months after the original wedding day. Chidinma was not present. She was in her 5th month of pregnancy, living with her parents in Oguta in the room that had been hers since childhood, attending prenatal appointments and keeping largely to herself. She had accepted the terms of what had been arranged without objection. She did not have the standing to object. Co-wives under one history. Chidinma gave birth in October. A boy strong-lunged, white-eyed, with the broad edge jaw already forming in his small face. Obinna was there at the hospital. He held his son for the first time with the careful reverence of a father who does not take the weight of a new life lightly. He named the boy Chukwuebuka, God is great, because in the strange, broken, improbable story that had brought this child into being, there was still, somehow, evidence of a grace larger than human calculation. Chidinma recovered. She moved, after extended discussions and a formal agreement, into a separate apartment in Enugu, closer to her parents than to Obinna's house. Obinna visited his son regularly, with the disciplined, earnest love of a man who has decided that whatever complications the adults have made, the child is innocent and deserves everything. Ades and Obinna built their life. It was not the life they had originally planned, because no life is. It was a life marked by what had happened. The way a landscape is marked by a flood, you can see where the water reached, even after it recedes. There were mornings when Ades woke beside her husband and felt the weight of those months in the storeroom, the darkness, the silence. There were evenings when she looked across the city and thought about her sister and felt the old love, the love that had no reference point in ordinary human experience, the love of a mirror that knows you from the inside, and also felt the distance she had placed between them, because Ades had cut Chidinma off. Not entirely and not without grief. But she had drawn a line that was clear. I will not pretend this did not happen. I will not act as if we are the same as we were. We are not. Something was done that cannot be undone, and while I forgive you, and I do forgive you, in my own time, in my own way, I forgive you, I will not go back to before. She sent Chidinma a message, once, a few months after Chukwuebuka was born. It was short. She had written and deleted many longer versions before settling on this one. I hope you and the baby are well. I know why you did what you did. I will never fully understand it, but I know why. You wanted us to still be the same. You wanted us to walk the same road. But the road was always going to split. You and I were always going to become ourselves, separately, eventually. That is not a tragedy. It was supposed to be a gift. I am sorry you could not see it that way before it was too late. I am working on forgiving you. It is slow work. Please give Ebuka a kiss for me. Chidinma read the message in her apartment in the evening, with Chukwuebuka asleep against her chest. And she cried in the particular way of someone who has received grace they do not deserve and knows it. She did not write back immediately. When she did, eventually, she wrote only, "Thank you, Ada. I am sorry. I will spend the rest of my life being sorry." They did not speak again for a long time after that. But the line had been drawn. The forgiveness was in motion, slow as a river in dry season, but moving. What the town saw. Oguta, of course, knew. A town the size of Oguta cannot keep a secret of that magnitude, not when wedding guests wonder why the chief bridesmaid was absent from the reception, not when neighbors see a woman locked in a storeroom emerge hollow-faced and travel in a hurry, not when the parish priest processes the unusual request that follows. The story leaked into the social fabric of the town in pieces, each piece more remarkable than the last, until by the end of it nearly everyone had heard some version. Some versions were wrong. Some versions were sensational. The story of the Okafor twins passed from veranda to veranda, from market stall to church porch, seasoned and embellished with each retelling, until it had acquired the dimensions of legend. The women who had been at the wedding shook their heads and said, "We were all there. We all thought it was Ades." And in that collective bewilderment was a kind of absolution, for Obinna. A man could not be blamed for not distinguishing what an entire church full of people could not distinguish. The older women of the town viewed Chidinma with varying degrees of harshness. Some called her names that no woman should be called. Others, women who had known the complicated pain of watching a sibling receive what they longed for, looked at her with a grief that was not quite condemnation. The thing that struck people most, when they reflected on the whole story, was not the deception itself. It was the detail that Emeka and Ngozi, standing in the church, had watched their younger daughter walk down the aisle in their older daughter's place and had not known. Their own parents. The people who had raised them and fed them, and sung them to sleep and held them through malaria fevers and plaited their hair in the same sitting room for 23 years. Even they had not known. Identical, people would say, shaking their heads. Truly identical. And then, inevitably, someone would add, but they are not the same anymore. No. They were not. They had entered that wedding morning as two people who shared everything and had emerged from it each in her own kind of darkness, as separate, distinct, irreducibly individual women. Adez had become someone who knew what it meant to trust absolutely and be absolutely betrayed. Chidinma had become someone who knew what it meant to take something that was not hers and live in the long consequence. They were no longer the twins in the way the town had always said it, as one word, one entity, one concept. They were Adez and Chidinma, two women, separate, struggling, surviving. The good luck or fortune that the old Dibia had prophesied had not abandoned them. Adesi's marriage, though forged in unusual fire, had a solidity that surprised even those who had doubted it. Obinna proved to be, in the truth that followed the deception, everything he had seemed to be, a man of genuine character, patient and loving, committed to rebuilding what had been broken with careful hands and a long view. His business grew. Adez completed her education, found work at a media house in Enugu, excelled in ways that her talent had always promised. Chidinma's son grew into a bright, laughing boy who looked alarmingly like his father and had his mother's voice. Chidinma herself began to emerge from the isolation of her shame slowly, cautiously, like a plant growing back toward light after a long season of no sun. She was not the woman she had been before. But she was a woman. She was learning to be one. The lesson written in flesh and blood. The oak of her family would speak, in later years, about what had happened, not often, not easily, but honestly. Emeka, who had grown old in the years that followed and who sat on his veranda in the evenings watching the Oguta lake catch the last light, would sometimes say to visitors who asked about his daughters, "God gave me two perfect children. Two perfect, identical children. And I thought that was the greatest blessing he could give. But I did not understand then that identical is not the same as one. They were always two. They were always going to need different things. The tragedy was that one of them could not accept that early enough." He paused always at this point, and looked at the lake. "The blessing is still there," he would continue. "It never left. But it came with a cost we did not see in the delivery room, all those years ago. God gives, and God also gives us the freedom to break the gift." They both survived. They both grew. And they both, another pause, the lake, the fading light, they both carry something of each other that they will never put down. Ngozi, who had gone largely grey in the year following the revelation, developed a habit of lighting two candles at the church, one for Adez, one for Chidinma, whenever she attended daily mass. She never explained this to anyone, but those who saw her there could see that when she knelt before the two flames, she prayed with equal intensity for both. Obinna, when he was old enough to be philosophical about it, would say in private conversations with people he trusted, "I am a man who was deceived by love. Not by wickedness, though there was wickedness, and what was done not by love." Chidinma loved. She loved wrong, and she loved recklessly, and she loved without counting the cost to others. But she loved. He would shake his head. "I cannot find it in me to hate her for that. I have tried. But I look at my son and I cannot." Adez never spoke publicly about what had happened. She did not give interviews. She did not participate in the telling of the story as it circulated through Uguta and beyond. She lived her life. Her proper, earned, hard-won life with the particular dignity of a woman who has decided that what was done to her will not define who she becomes. But once, at a women's fellowship meeting at their church in Enugu, a young woman asked her, not knowing her story, not knowing any of it, what she would say to another woman who felt that she could never be complete on her own, who felt that her identity only existed in relationship to someone else, who was afraid of being singular and insufficient and alone. Adez was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell her this, you were made whole. You were born whole. And there is no one, not a twin, not a lover, not a parent, not a best friend, whose wholeness completes your own. Your wholeness is already inside you. The work is to find it. And the danger is to mistake someone else's life for the proof that you are lacking yours." The young woman nodded and wrote the words down. She did not know that the woman who had spoken them had learned them in the specific, brutal school of experience, had had them inscribed on her spirit in the darkness of a storeroom, and in the strange grace of a marriage that survived what should have ended it, and in the long, slow, incomplete, ongoing work of forgiving the person who was her first mirror and her deepest wound. The lake and the light. Chukwuebuka Ez was 7 years old when he first asked his mother why his father lived in a different house from them. Chidinma had prepared for this question. She had spent years preparing for it. She sat down with him on the low step of their veranda and looked at the boy, his father's jaw, her own eyes, and thought about what to say. She said, "Your father loves you very much. He will always be your father. And there is also a woman in his life who is very important. Her name is Adez. She is your father's wife. And Adez is also—" She paused. "This was the part that was hardest. She is also my sister. Your aunt." The boy thought about this with the focused attention children give to new information. "So Auntie Adez is your sister?" He said, "Yes. Then you and Auntie Adez are family, and Daddy is also family, which means we are all family." Chidinma looked at her son. She felt something shift in her chest, not break, not close, but shift, like a door moving on old hinges. "Yes," she said quietly. "We are all family." He thought about it a little more. Then, "Does Auntie Adez like me?" Chidinma remembered the message. The single line at the end of it, "Please give Ebuka a kiss for me." "Yes," she said. "She does." He seemed satisfied with this. He jumped off the step and ran toward the yard, shouting about something he had seen: a lizard, a butterfly, the ordinary, miraculous things that a 7-year-old boy finds urgent and necessary. Chidinma watched him run. The Uguta Lake, if you drove to it from Enugu, was perhaps 2 hours away. On clear days, if you stood at its edge, you could see your own reflection in its surface. The lake was that still, that true, that unblinking. The old people said that the lake had memory, that it held in its depths the histories of everyone who had ever stood at its edge. If the lake could remember, it would remember the Okafor twins, the 2 girls who had arrived in the world on a Valentine's Thursday, wrapped in each other, identical and indivisible, glowing with a luck that seemed to belong to them jointly. It would remember them running at its edge on childhood Sundays, their matching dresses flying behind them. It would remember them growing, same height, same face, same laugh, same grief, through all the years of their twinhood. It would remember the morning one of them chose wrong. It would remember the darkness that followed, and the light that slowly, imperfectly, humanly came after. And it would remember this, that the good fortune the old Dibia had prophesied had never, in fact, left the Okafor family. It had gone underground for a time, like a river in dry season, invisible but moving. And it had returned not as the simple, golden luck of childhood, the spontaneous generosity of market women and taxi drivers, but as something harder one and therefore more durable, the luck of survival, the luck of truth, the luck of a grace that is chosen painfully, against every temptation to choose bitterness instead. Both twins had it. They would always have it. They were, after all, still the daughters of Emeka and Ngozi Okafor of Oguta. Still the children whose arrival had filled every clay pot with palm wine, and made an old Dibia smile. Still the bearers of rightness, of ancestral blessing. They were still, In all the ways that time and choice and consequence had not erased, each other's twin, different roads, different lives, the same source, the same blood, running in both directions, back to the same warm, unrepeatable, common beginning. W. B. Ezzy, it is true. W. D. Marg, it is well. The end.
Like, share, and subscribe for more tales of African magic, mischief, and redemption.